A slave ship is making its way toward West Africa, its white crew members on board, alongside the captain and a slave trader who owns the vessel. Once they dock at the harbor, the crew embarks on a brutal mission to raid villages, capturing as many slaves as possible. The plan unfolds, and hundreds of African men, women, and children are seized. Chained and forced to march toward the ship, they are bewildered. They don't understand why they've been captured or taken aboard these ships. Many had heard stories about white people coming from distant lands to take Africans, but they had no idea they were being enslaved and transported to a new world where they would live their entire lives in bondage. However, the most harrowing experience for these captives begins on the slave ship. Just hours ago they were free, but now they are shackled and helpless, unaware of what awaits them. The ship's purpose is to break their spirits, establish the authority of the white crew, and prepare them for a life of forced labor. But what exactly happened to these enslaved Africans on these notorious slave ships? In this video, we delve into this painful chapter of Black history. The Atlantic slave trade began in 1526, when the Portuguese first brought African slaves to colonial Brazil. This practice soon spread, with merchants from Spain, Britain, France, Denmark, and the Netherlands eager to partake in the immensely profitable trade, disregarding any moral or ethical concerns in favor of the wealth it brought. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, about 12 million Africans were uprooted from their homelands, stripped of their identities, and reduced to commodities for economic exploitation. Many of these captives were part of the transatlantic slave trade, a vast network linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The journey from Africa to the Americas, known as the Middle Passage, was a nightmare. During the 16th and 17th centuries, this harrowing voyage could last up to 6 months. However, with advancements in navigation in the 18th and 19th centuries, the trip was shortened to just a few weeks, intensifying the volume of human cargo. Men, women, and children viewed not as people, but as goods to be sold to plantation owners in the New World. The terror began even before the ship set sail. Captives were gathered from various regions of Africa, often after enduring brutal marches. Shackled together in what was known as slave trains, they were taken to coastal port cities, many of which they had never seen before. Upon encountering the massive vessels, the sheer terror of what awaited them was unimaginable. Once they reached the ships, they were confined below deck. Olaudah Equiano, a former slave who later became a key figure in the abolition movement, vividly described his traumatic experience on a slave ship. He recalled feeling confused and terrified, unsure if the white men intended to kill or eat him. The sight of countless other Africans chained together in sorrow and despair overwhelmed him, causing him to faint. The conditions aboard these ships were beyond horrific. The chains that bound the enslaved Africans cut into their skin, making movement excruciating. Death was a constant companion. Many captives succumbed to disease, starvation, or sheer despair. The bodies of the dead were often left among the living for hours or even days before being thrown overboard. The stench of death and disease permeated the lower decks, further weakening the health and spirits of those who survived. Men and women were typically segregated into different compartments, creating an environment rife with abuse. Tragically, sexual violence was common, with female slaves subjected to rape and other forms of abuse by the sailors and crew. This violence was rarely discouraged unless it threatened the progress of the voyage. In many cases, captives came from the same village and knew each other. To further demoralize them, the crew would separate couples. Husbands and wives were torn apart, with the women often taken to the men's compartment, where they were abused in front of everyone. This dehumanizing practice was a means for the crew to assert their dominance and instill fear. The worst acts of brutality were committed in front of children, ensuring that the trauma would last a lifetime. John Newton, a former slave ship captain, recalled a particularly disturbing incident where one of his crew members assaulted a pregnant woman in full view of the entire deck. Any signs of resistance were met with brutal punishment. One of the most common forms of torture was the thumb screw, a device designed to slowly crush the victim's thumbs and inflict maximum pain. Despite being seen as profitable assets, the enslaved Africans were subjected to severe starvation, receiving only meager portions of food. The brutal conditions, coupled with relentless abuse and the constant fear of an unknown fate, drove many to the brink of despair. Some, overwhelmed by their circumstances, sought any opportunity to end their lives. It was difficult for them to imagine that life in a new land could be any better. Slave traders packed the ships far beyond their intended capacity. While designed to carry hundreds, these vessels were often overloaded with thousands of captives, cramped so tightly that they had barely any space to move, sit, or sleep. The conditions were so confined that basic necessities, like buckets for waste, were often inaccessible, forcing the enslaved to endure their own filth. The infamous Brooks slave ship, for example, became a symbol of these inhumane conditions. Detailed diagrams of the ship later served as powerful evidence against the slave trade. Olaudah Equiano, in his account of his time aboard a slave ship, described the overpowering stench below deck, a smell so unbearable it made eating impossible. He longed for death as the only escape from the horrors surrounding him. Defying the crew was met with extreme consequences. Those who refused to eat, attempted to escape, or showed signs of resistance were subjected to savage floggings. Equiano himself was severely flogged for refusing to eat and was held down by 2 men while a third lashed him mercilessly. Though rare, rebellions were met with extreme violence. Desperate captives, having nothing left to lose, sometimes rose up against the crew, only to be suppressed by cannon fire, muskets, and further bloodshed. The enslaved were only allowed on deck when the weather permitted. Otherwise, they endured suffocating heat and stench below deck, crammed together with hundreds of others. For many, it felt as though they were buried alive. Overcrowding, coupled with the sweltering heat, created breeding grounds for disease. Dysentery, or the flux, was particularly deadly, and outbreaks were a constant threat. A former ship surgeon once compared the blood and mucus-covered rooms to a slaughterhouse. The health and survival of the enslaved were crucial for the ship's profitability. Crew members resorted to flogging and other punishments to ensure compliance. In 1727, a slave aboard the Loyal George, a ship traveling to Barbados, refused to eat. Captain Timothy Tucker, fearing this act of defiance might inspire others, ordered the man to be flogged mercilessly. Despite the threat of death, the man calmly replied, "Ad doma," which meant "so be it" in his language, a haunting acceptance of his fate. The practice of throwing enslaved individuals overboard was tragically common. This allowed ship owners to file insurance claims for each drowned person, as insurance policies didn't cover sickness. If the ship became too overcrowded, the crew sometimes threw slaves overboard to reduce weight and protect their profits. Before doing so, the enslaved person's ears were often dismembered and shown to investors, as proof that slaves had been captured, but had to be discarded for the safety of the ship. After 6 to 8 agonizing weeks aboard the slave ship, the surviving captives finally reached a port in the Americas. Many feared they were destined for consumption, but older slaves reassured them they were to be put to work. However, this small relief did little to change the grim reality ahead: a life of enslavement, where their humanity would be routinely disregarded. Did you know such atrocities took place on the slave ships? Do you think this part of history is adequately taught in schools? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. Would you want your children to know this dark reality, or would you prefer them to remain unaware of this part of history? If you want to see more videos like this, please support us by subscribing to the American Storyline and clicking the bell icon. You can also explore more videos on our channel.